Before guns, before cannons, before tanks, power was measured in a single line of metal. This is the story of how the sword was born in bronze and perfected in steel. For over 5,000 years, swords shaped battles, empires, and legends. But they didn't start as perfect weapons. They bent, they broke, they evolved. Tonight, we're traveling from the very first true swords in ancient Turkey, through the Bronze and Iron Ages, past Rome and the Vikings, into the age of knights and duels, to see how a simple blade of metal became the most iconic weapon in human history. And along the way, you might just discover which era of sword you would have trusted with your life. Spears, axes, bows. There were many weapons in the ancient world, so why did the sword become the symbol of warriors, kings, and honor? A sword is more than just a tool of war. It's personal. It's carried at the side, drawn at arm's reach, and often forged for a single owner. Its length and balance make it an extension of the body, a weapon of skill, not just strength. But to understand how we reached the elegant steel blades of knights and samurai, we have to go back to the moment when someone first pushed metal just long enough that it stopped being a dagger and became a sword. If we follow the trail of archaeology, the first weapons we can truly call swords appear around 3,300 to 3000 BCE. They were found at Arslantepe, in what is now eastern Turkey. Here, buried in an ancient complex, archaeologists uncovered long blades of arsenical bronze, measuring around 60 centimeters, about 24 inches. Before Tese, we find shorter copper and bronze blades in places like Mesopotamia and Egypt, but most of those are closer to large knives or daggers at Arslantepe. For the first time, we see blades long and robust enough that historians and archaeologists agree. This is where the sword is truly born. Imagine one of those early warriors, gripping a strange, newly forged weapon, longer than a knife, heavy with the glow of polished bronze. In that moment, the idea of the sword enters human history. As time moves forward into the early Bronze Age, between about 2200 and 1600 BCE, the idea of the sword spreads. In Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Aegean, bronze blades grow more refined. They're often still short by our standards, but they're clearly designed to cut and thrust, not just stab like a dagger. Casting techniques improve. Blacksmiths learn how to shape stronger bronze, how to thicken the spine of the blade, and how to attach hilts more securely. The sword is still expensive, still elitophon, a mark of status or ceremony. But something important is happening. Cultures across the ancient world are beginning to trust a longer blade. They're learning that a well-made sword can be more than a symbol. It can be a reliable weapon on the battlefield. By the late Bronze Age, roughly 1500 to 1100 BCE, sword design takes a major step forward. One of the most influential types is known today as the Naui-II sword. It appears in Central Europe, spreads into Mycenaean Greece, and across the wider Mediterranean world. This sword has a sturdy, cut-and-thrust blade and a stronger, often integrated hilt, making it less likely to snap at the handle, an important weakness in earlier designs. You can think of the Naui-II as one of the first standard longswords. It's the kind of weapon that could be mass-produced for real armies, not just a handful of elites. On windswept hills and coastal strongholds, warriors gripped these bronze swords, trusting that the metal in their hand could withstand the brutal clash of shield and spear. But bronze had limits, and the next revolution was already heating in the forge. Around 800 to 500 BCE, we enter the early Iron Age, with cultures like the Hallstatt groups in Central Europe. Iron ore is more common than the tin needed for bronze. That means, over time, iron weapons can be made in greater numbers. Early ironworking is difficult, quality varies, and some of these blades are crude, but when done well, iron can be harder and tougher than bronze. At first, many iron swords look like direct descendants of late Bronze Age designs. The shapes are familiar, the material is new. Swords and daggers coexist. In some places, longer blades briefly fall out of favor, then return, as smiths improve their craft. But the direction is clear. The age of bronze is fading. The age of iron and steel is beginning. By the late Iron Age, roughly 450 to 50 BC, swords in Celtic Europe often associated with the Latin culture grow, long and flexible, suited for slashing from horseback or on foot. These blades are iron, sometimes with early steel edges, carried by warriors whose reputation for ferocity impressed and frightened their neighbors. Long, elegant, and often richly decorated at the hilt, these swords bridge the gap between the older iron traditions and what will eventually become the Roman spatha and later European straight swords. Each swing of a Celtic blade carried more than just force. It carried identity, style, and the mark of a specific people at a specific moment in time. In the classical Mediterranean, the sword evolves again to match a new style of war. The Romans adopt and refine the gladius, short, double-edged sword optimized for close-range thrusting behind a shield. In dense formations, legionaries don't need long swing. They need quick, deadly stabs into the exposed parts of an enemy line. Later, a longer sword called the spatha becomes more common, especially among cavalry. Over time, the spatha spreads and begins to replace the gladius even for infantry. Its longer reach suits changing tactics and formations. These Roman swords, especially the spatha, will directly influence the blades of early medieval Europe. When you see a Viking sword or a knightly sword, centuries later, you're seeing distant descendants of that Roman idea, a straight, double-edged blade built for the realities of its battlefield. As the Roman Empire fades, we enter the migration period and the Viking Age, from about the 4th to the 10th century CE. In Germanic kingdoms and among the Vikings, swords become prized possessions, sometimes named, sometimes passed down as heirlooms. Many of these blades are pattern-welded, bundles of iron and steel twisted together, creating flowing patterns along the metal. This isn't just decoration. It can help blend different qualities of metal, aiming for both toughness and a sharp edge. These swords are relatively broad and straight, with simple crossguards and distinctive pommels. They carry the genetic line of the Roman spatha, but now they belong to a new world of mead halls, raids, and sagas. Imagine a Viking warrior gripping such a sword on a cold, wet shoreline, trusting that layered, patterned steel with his life. When you imagine a sword, what do you see? For many of us, it's this: the classic knightly sword. By the High Middle Ages, from the 11th to 13th centuries, this is the blade that dominates. These arming swords are straight, double-edged, and typically wielded in one hand, often paired with a shield or used from horseback. The hilt forms a simple cross, which later takes on powerful religious symbolism for Christian knights. Steelmaking has improved dramatically. Blades are now carefully heat-treated to find that perfect balance between a hard edge that can cut and a flexible body that woe and shatter. A good sword can cut, thrust, and parry with reliable strength. This is the age when the sword isn't just a weapon, it becomes a badge of rank, a central symbol in oaths and ceremonies, and is often buried with its owner. To carry such a blade is to carry status, responsibility, and the expectation of skill. As armor evolves into full plate, swords must adapt again. In the 13th to 15th centuries, we see the rise of the longsword, a blade with a longer grip, often used with two hands for greater control and power. Contrary to myth, these swords are not heavy, clumsy clubs. In skilled hands, they are precise instruments, used to bind an opponent's blade, control distance, and strike at the vulnerable gaps in armor. Some weapons specialize even further. Estocs, which are stiff, narrow blades, focus almost entirely on thrusting into armor joints. Very large greatswords and zwinders appear on certain battlefields, used to disrupt formations and cut through ranks of pikes or poles. Every change in armor, every new tactic, and every evolution in training leaves its mark on the metal. BD's point, the sword is a fully mature technology, refined, diverse, and deeply woven into the fabric of medieval life and warfare. Then, as gunpowder reshapes the battlefield, heavy armor becomes less practical, and the role of the sword shifts once again. In the cities of Renaissance Europe, the rapier appears. This is a long, slender, thrusting sword designed for civilian duels and These blades are optimized for speed and precision, not for hacking through armor. Swordsmanship becomes a civilian art, with fencing schools, detailed manuals, and a huge emphasis on timing, distance, and honor. On the battlefield, curved sabres and other military swords serve cavalry and officers. They're used alongside firearms, no longer the main killing tool, but still vital in close combat. And as powerful symbols of command, the sword is moving from the center of war to the edge of culture, becoming half weapon, half fashion accessory, and half a language of status all its own. By the 18th to 20th centuries, firearms dominate large-scale warfare. Rifles, machine guns, and artillery make the sword increasingly obsolete as a primary battlefield weapon. Yet, the sword refuses to disappear. Instead, it transforms into a symbol. Officers carry swords as marks of rank. Ceremonial sabres glitter in parades and formal events. In some cultures, traditional sword arts survive as martial disciplines, focused on technique, philosophy, and heritage rather than real combat. Today, swords live on in museums, dojos, reenactments, movies, and games. They may no longer decide the fate of empires, but they still rule our imagination. From fragile arsenical bronze in Arslantepe to the first iron blades in Celtic Europe, from the Roman gladius and Viking steel, to knightly swords, rapiers, and ceremonial sabres. The evolution of the sword is really the evolution of us. Every era shaped its blades to match its fears, its technology, and its idea of honor. And even when the sword left the battlefield, it never left our stories. Now I want to hear from you. If you had to choose a sword from any era: Bronze Age, Roman, Viking, medieval knight, or Renaissance duelist, which one would you carry, and why? Tell me in the comments. If you enjoyed this journey through 5,000 years of steel, hit like. Share this with someone who loves ancient weapons, and subscribe to join this growing community of sword and history fanatics. This is Echoes of Steel, and our next story is already being forged.